Ah, I some time ago had the opportunity to listen to an exchange between Sargon and actually an exchange on AA's channel. Sargon went about giving a defense of liberal democracy, a defense of sorts. And so in that exchange, I thought there were some really interesting ideas that came to the forefront, but I felt that some key elements were missing, and because those issues never really came up, laying forward a concrete, rather a description, the description of what the replacement to liberal democracy would look like fails to emerge, right? Uh, I, and I think I'll be able to bring out those elements and try to create a picture of what the replacement to liberal democracy would look like. And so the scope of my discussion, possibly split it into two parts. Summarize the disagreement, right? Acknowledge the concerns of both sides as legitimate. Explore the things that I think didn't come up that were important. Try to apply it in our context, in particular looking at the bastions that our enemies, right, have erected to shield themselves and to prevent our advance in the intellectual sense or in terms of the social project we'd like to bring about. And from there, argue for a type of conviviality, right, which I think is a key element of any replacement to liberal democracy, right, and address how to communicate that idea, right. In particular, I think that there are two elements of a vision that we fail to examine, and in not looking at those two elements, we end up characterizing visions as either positive or negative, and I feel a vision would have both a positive and a negative element to it, right? And attempt to propose a general solution, right? Hoping that it be of a decent quality. Now, the case for liberal democracy now takes the form of that. Okay, I think there'll be like 4 expressions of what the case for liberal democracy is in our world. In particular, even after we have acknowledged the weaknesses of the problems or the flaws within the system, because I think we would all acknowledge that there is no political order or system or formula that we can apply that would end up being perfect, right? That will not need adjustments, that will not tweaking, and even will not need replacing at some point, right? So on one point, the people point out how that yes, it's not perfect, but there is no better alternative as of yet, right? For whichever reason. Some would say that yes, liberal democracy is already here, it's entrenched, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So it'd be basically futile to deal with it. Some would point out that as long as the meta factors, right, the factors of human nature and of the technology that we're using and the effect it's having on people, liberal democracy is a consequence of that. So as long as the theosocial context remains the same, right, particularly in the area of material needs and the efficiencies necessary that would create a certain competitive advantage within competing groups, well, we are stuck with it, right? Some would even make the point that liberal democracy is not as bad as we make it out to be, right? And the bad things are a trade-off, right? So we are better off with it, and the bad things are a trade-off that we have to learn to live with, right? And so I think you can summarize this idea as that there is no viable path away from liberal democracy, right? And therefore we have to find ways to live with it and to mitigate the negative effects. And now both the people who argue for liberal democracy or against it, in particular from the context of dissident thinking, right? I think both sides have legitimate concerns, right? Because on one end, you can't just allow evil to have a free run, right? Even when they're overwhelming with power, right? Doing nothing at times can be foolish, right? But in the same time, you're not without tools or powers or abilities or opportunities, right? And so we do acknowledge that there is a certain measure of imprudence in spending time and energy towards something that is bound to fail, rather than redirecting those resources to a more productive end, right? And then you also know that there's a certain wisdom to knowing when to fight and when to disengage, when to retreat and when to be belligerent, right? Yes, so I think a good way of thinking through this would be seeing what's broken and then target that, like the object, right? So if we conceptualize our social relations and the social arrangement as an object, and we notice that there are certain breaks in a particular area, how do we target those breaks, right? And so I think these are the elements, like this was the part of by acknowledging, like it was taken for granted that yes, there are imperfections, there are problems that need to be dealt with, and these problems are bad, right? And they didn't touch on in those problems, right? And in not doing so, I think you couldn't pivot off from that into constructing an alternative resolution, right? What if we use the problems within liberal democracy and use that as a guide, as a marker, as to what axioms we need to adopt in order to fix the problem, right? So what is the problem? What is the ailment affecting us, right? So there's the who answer to that question, and there's the what answer to that question, right? And the who is generally clear. Elites who are not serving their function properly, and they're creating a certain chaos or disorder within the framework that people have to work in. And what are these issues, right? I think first there's the question of virtue and ethics, right? That there is complete moral collapse, right? And there is moral chaos. And the moral discourse is so broken that people are not even able to speak within the same terms, right? And certain thinkers who have written on this matter that we can borrow from in different institutions. There's Stanley Hauers, who I think is a Christian left-winger, right? And there's Alas de McIntyre, right? Who I think analyzes the problem from what people would call right wing, right? And so even though these two people would say that they have got a common, they have a common or a shared view of ultimate concern, right? In that these are committed practicing Christians, one linked to the politics of the left and another linked to the politics of the right. In the assessment, you find that yes, we do have a problem with our moral discourse, right? And moral discourse stems from ultimate concern, right? And so we have a problem with our religion, we have a problem with our virtues, and we have a problem with our ethical systems, right? And we also have the issues of social capital and social cohesion, right? How do we receive our cultural heritages and we pass it on, right? What are we doing with our legacy? And so that is also another problem because it's fragmented, it's broken, right? Social capital is being consumed. So one of the key problems that liberal democracy is creating is that social capital is being consumed but is not being maintained. And how do you keep a community, how do you keep a society, how do you maintain it without adequate social capital towards a direction of change or social cohesion to keep it together, and especially during times of crisis, right? And so there is work that is necessary, work that needs to be done for healing and restoration of these things. And it is pretty clear, I think, to most people at this point that liberal democracy cannot serve that function. It's this rich kid who has received this huge, this inheritance and has squandered it. And you realize that if there's no trustee to take over, right? That the resources will be used to the extent that it will be gone. It will all gone, right? So we do agree that, I hope we do agree that there is work necessary for healing and restoration, right? And the other thing we need to consider is the notion of virtual wealth and real wealth, right? This dichotomy I could present it as the conflict between money and property, right? The whole notion of you will own nothing and be happy, right? So we can say it's enclosure applied to the liberal economy or to the free market, right? Where people have been taken to this type of neo-feudalism, right? And then they are kicked out of the property because there is much more money to be made by not having serfs within your property, right? But rather having investments, so to speak, like sheep, in quotes, right? Not in the human sense, figuratively, right? But a certain product, a certain service that will replace the people and generate the profit in accordance to the demands of the market, right? And so the people who have been kicked out need something that will serve the role of real wealth. It will take the place of wealth in a particular manner, right? And so this is what I'm calling a virtual wealth. So money, right? It represents something. It's a symbol, right? It's a simulacra of sorts. And so that's why I'm describing it as you receive money, right? But if there's total collapse, what does money do, right? If your government collapses, what's the value of the money? So the money is supposed to be like a store of value, right? It is a symbol of something else, a symbol of something real. And so in liberal democracy, you find that people are being pushed more and more towards virtual wealth, right? Rather than the real deal, right? So you've got simulacra of relationships, right? So, hey, look, you can have this AI companion, right? You can pay for this service to cuddle with this particular woman for 2 hours. You can pay someone to go out on a date with you. We can mediate all these things to you as a service, right? You need to meet somebody for romantic interest. We'll provide you with Tinder, right? So there's this replacement of the real with the virtual, right? Because at the end of the day, the emotions, the feeling are the same. And this comfort, right? This coddling, this putting people in a particular psychological state that they'll be okay with a particular type of status quo is something that liberal democracy is pushing people towards, right? And at the same time, when you have all these problems, right, you've got this moral collapse and moral chaos. We've got this consumption, loss of social capital, and the loss of social cohesion, right? And you have these people who have been given virtual wealth, right, instead of real wealth, right? So it creates this weird mass of, it's this powder keg that can explode at any time, right? Especially when it becomes unsustainable. And at the same time, you have to deal with, within the elite class, a certain type of parasitism, right? Or, you know, you contend with problems such as issues of elite overproductions, right? You're contending with factors such as what Spandrel would call bio-Leninism, right? Whereby the practical concerns of maintaining position and power and the incentives that become embedded within the social systems are such that you're creating these parasitic relationships instead of symbiotic relationships, right? And so the properties, these I think would point to us the properties necessary to what we need to build to replace liberal democracy, right? Because at the end of the day, no matter what name you give the thing, whether you call him a Kaiser, whether you call him Caesar, whether you call him an emperor, whether you call him a king, whether you call him a president, whether you call him a chairman, there's a certain hierarchy of relations that are necessary, right? And there are certain, and it's supposed to be symbiotic. It's supposed to be an interdependence. And if that is expressed in a wrong way, regardless of how you arrange your social hierarchy, you're hurtling towards a disaster. You're hurtling towards a breaking point, right? And so we would agree that liberal democracy is not convivial, in that it does not allow us to live and thrive and prosper with each other, right? So even with some of the issues, let's say like immigration, right? Immigration is not done in a convivial manner. It's not done in a way that can allow the thriving of the two groups, right? It's done at the expense of others, right? And which creates hostility within them, right? It's not sustainable, right? Can people live holistically in that manner? And which is a point that people have belabored, and most people would agree is pretty clear. And it doesn't help that our opponents express our thinking in a myopic manner, like a strawman of sorts, right? A faulty generalization, right? Yes. And so when what we are lamenting is the way an activity is being pursued, we're being presented as opponents to that activity, right? And so we need to push towards fixing social relations, right? And working for concrete wealth in addition to virtual wealth, right? And so we can look in the modern world where such problems can be found expressed, right? So let's say in Japan, there were issues about the unwillingness to help others, right? Issues with suicides and aging populations, right? These are markers of problems within certain social relations that need to be fixed, right? Yeah. And so this would lead us to discussing present elements, right, that are embedded within the liberal democracy that make it inadequate. And these are the elements, and these are the areas that we would need to replacement, right? This is where the change needs to be. This is the part that needs to be targeted, right? And so we can say that liberal democracy is actually attacking the body, the mind, and the spirit, right? And it's doing this through the therapeutic state, right? And this therapeutic state is supposed to be the substitute for the moral and the psychic chaos that it's producing, right? And so it's to create this status quo whereby we are economic units that are producing in this chaos, right, without rocking the boat too much, right? And so there's the element of culture, right, where there's the exploitation of thin culture. Thick culture is seen as bigoted, right, by the left wing, right? And the right wing, or at least conservative right wing, has also become really individualistic. So you find thick culture is being attacked on two fronts and from two angles, right? On one end as being too bigoted, right? And on the other end as being too collectivistic, yeah? And this is also being supported in a way intellectually or ideologically with pluralism, right? So you've got a naive pluralism that says all these things are true, but they are relative, right? Or they are subjective, right? So let's say morality, right? Moral system, ethical systems, right? Some will say they're all true, but they're relative, right? And others will say they're all false, but they're useful, right? So let's say religion. So people say that all religions ultimately lead to the same thing, but but you're just looking at the same object from it's blind people looking at the same object from different angles, looking at the same of feeling and describing. Let's say once describing the elephant, like, oh look, it's a trunk. No, another one is like, no, it's hard and like a tusk. Then the other guy like, no, it's expansive, like the side of the elephant, right? So all these arguments are trying to claim that these cultural artifacts, right, are true, but they're relative. But then some are a bit more sophisticated in that when you examine their systems, you find that they are contradictory and mutually exclusive in many respects, right? And so some will come and say that no. Yes, they are mutually exclusive, but they are useful and they are all false, right? So that person would say that all religions serve the purpose of, let's say they will appeal to René Girard, right? And so all religions are that which will allow us to form communities, a bond to tie us together. But there is actually ultimately no God, right? It's actually not based on a fundamental truth. So it's useful, but they're all false. So under both perspectives, the structure is pluralistic, right? And in this sense, many of us would discover that yes, we are indeed children of the swamp, because this is the understanding that we have of our social relations, right? And so we see it as a necessary noble lie, right? And so that's a sophisticated pluralism, or it's a subjective truth. And so that's the naive pluralism, right? And in this context of think culture and the therapeutic state and an expansive political order that is seizing everything, and it's bringing about this new type of feudalism, right? Virtual wealth is being given to comfort people, and it's being combined with subversion, because it's easier to subvert thin culture than thick culture, right? In the sense that Patrick Deneen defines thin and thick culture, and also containment, right? And containment is justified as to preserving the order, protecting the country, even though the spirit of the original thing is long dead, right? And so it's also pushing us into equivocating materialism, right? And naturalism as the middle ground when it's not. Yeah. And so so it's one of the elements of this truth regime that you could say is quite problematic. And you can see, even though they describe the our theories of the understanding of truth, right? The understanding of truth that they present, the understanding of good and evil that they present, the understanding of even existence that they present, it's a skewed view, but they present it as if it's the middle ground, as if it's true, right? And so if I had to jump and use some of the formal terms, right? So there's a particular epistemology, there's a particular aesthetics, and there's a particular ethics, right? That is being combined with a particular metaphysics, and is being presented as neutral when it's not, right? And so, but then these are the conditions that are necessary for the ideological frame of mind that allows people to live under a liberal democratic system. Because how do you justify these competing structures, right? There's competing diversities in quotes, right? Despite their conflicts, they have to be either relative or they have to be false but useful, right? And so these are the tools that are being used to keep people within that particular frame, rather than them adjusting to the world around them, to the reality that they're within, and develop the new systems and the new tools necessary to survive under that new environment. It's like it's an ice age, right? If we are used to going north for the winter, the north is going to be too cold, too frozen. We now have to start to learn to move south. If we're used to farming and the environment here has become too hostile to farming, we perhaps need to switch to hunting, right? So humans usually adjust to the circumstance in accordance to the, pragmatic adjustments. And so liberal democracy serves as the hindrance to this pragmatic adjustment by presenting this noble lie of pluralism, right? Yeah. And so it makes living with too hard, right? And I think I'll stop here, and I'll come back and follow the rest of my contentions in a second part, because it's been too long. But I hope all is well with you and your life and your friends and your family. And I pray that it will be well with you and for those you love, and you'd experience through joy and a good life and a fulfilling and meaningful life. And I truly desire that for practically everyone, right? Yeah. And so this is my mission currently. This is what I desire. that you be able to live with those you love and those you care about, that you be able to have good, full, and fruitful relationships. And I hope this might help click something inside that will push you into that direction, and perhaps pull you away from something that would keep you from that conviviality with the lie. Okay. Yeah.